Today, let's delve into an experiment that has the power to shake the very foundations of our understanding of human nature, the Milgram Experiment. This isn't just another psychological study. It's a profound investigation that strips bare the essence of humanity and reveals uncomfortable truths about our inherent tendencies. The Milgram Experiment stands as one of the most renowned psychological experiments in history, designed by Stanley Milgram, a distinguished American social psychologist and professor at Yale University during the 1960s. What makes this experiment particularly fascinating and disturbing is how it exposes the fragility of our moral compass when confronted with authority. When Milgram conceived this experiment, he wasn't merely pursuing academic curiosity. The world was still processing the horrors of World War II, with international tribunals bringing Nazi war criminals to justice. As these trials unfolded, a troubling question emerged. While high-ranking Nazi officials clearly deserved punishment for their atrocities against Jewish people, what about the countless subordinates who actually carried out these brutal acts? Were they merely following orders, or should they bear equal responsibility for these unconscionable crimes? This moral quandary inspired Milgram to design an experiment that would test the limits of human resistance when faced with authoritative commands that contradicted basic ethical principles. How far would ordinary people go when instructed to inflict pain on innocent strangers? Would their conscience prevail, or would they surrender their moral agency to authority? The brilliance of Milgram's experimental design lies in its simplicity and its ability to recreate, in a controlled environment, the psychological dynamics that might have enabled ordinary Germans to participate in extraordinary evil. By examining how everyday Americans responded to similar pressures, Milgram hoped to understand whether the capacity for blind obedience was uniquely German or universally human. What he discovered would send shockwaves through the scientific community and challenge our collective self-perception as morally autonomous beings. The results would prove so disturbing that they would forever change how we understand the relationship between authority, obedience, and human ethics. If you find yourself intrigued by the darker corners of human psychology, I invite you to continue exploring this remarkable study with me as we uncover exactly how the experiment was conducted and what its shocking results reveal about the human condition. The Milgram Experiment emerged during a pivotal moment in history, when humanity was still grappling with the aftermath of World War II. In courtrooms across Europe, the International Military Tribunal was prosecuting Nazi war criminals for atrocities that had shocked the conscience of the world. The systematic persecution and genocide of Jewish people represented a moral failure of such magnitude that it demanded explanation beyond simple evil. What troubled Stanley Milgram deeply was a recurring defense offered by many defendants. "I was just following orders." This seemingly simple justification raised profound questions about human nature and moral responsibility. While it was easy to condemn the architects of genocide, the Hitler, Himmler, and Jew ring figures, what about the thousands of ordinary Germans who staffed concentration camps, transported victims, or pulled triggers? Were these people inherently monstrous, or were they ordinary individuals caught in extraordinary circumstances? Did they bear full moral responsibility for their actions, or was their culpability diminished by the pressures of authority? Most importantly, would Americans, raised in a democratic tradition that emphasized individual rights and moral autonomy, behave any differently under similar pressures? These questions weren't merely academic for Milgram. As a Jewish psychologist who had fled Europe, he understood the stakes of such inquiry. If the capacity for blind obedience to malevolent authority was uniquely German, a product of their authoritarian culture, then democratic societies might be naturally immune. But if this tendency was universal, hardwired into human psychology, then no society could consider itself safe from similar moral collapse. Milgram designed his experiment to test precisely this boundary. When faced with direct commands to violate their conscience and inflict apparent harm on innocent strangers, how would ordinary Americans respond? Would their moral compass override their tendency to comply with authority, or would they, like the Nazi functionaries, surrender their ethical judgment to someone in a position of power? The experiment would need to create a situation where participants believed they were causing real pain to another person, while simultaneously being encouraged by an authority figure to continue despite any moral qualms. It would need to quantify exactly how far people would go when pushed by authority, and identify what factors might strengthen or weaken their resistance. What Mum couldn't have anticipated was how his carefully constructed laboratory scenario would uncover uncomfortable truths about human nature that would challenge our most cherished beliefs about moral autonomy and reveal the fragility of conscience when confronted with the simple power of a white coat and a confident command. The Mum experiment was ingeniously constructed to explore the depths of human obedience in the face of authority. It began with a seemingly innocuous advertisement seeking volunteers for a social psychology study at Yale University. Participants were promised a small compensation of $4.50 for their time, an enticing sum that in the 1960s equated to about $20.30 today. This straightforward recruiting tactic ensured a diverse pool of volunteers, unaware of the true nature of the experiment they were about to join. Upon arriving at the university, each participant was escorted to a basement laboratory, where they encountered two individuals, a researcher clad in a white lab coat and another volunteer, who would later serve as the learner in the experiment. The researcher explained that the study aimed to examine the effects of punishment on learning, specifically how physical pain could influence a student's performance. Participants were instructed to draw lots to determine their roles as either the teacher or the learner. However, the selection was rigged. Every participant drew the role of teacher, while the student role was always assigned to the Confederate actor. The teacher would be tasked with administering a memory test to the learner, who was seated in a separate room. The teacher read pairs of words to the learner and subsequently tested their recall. Here's where the experiment took a sinister turn. Between the two rooms, a thin partition separated the teacher from the learner, who was attached to a device designed to deliver electric shocks. The teacher was informed that the shocks would increase in intensity from 45 volts to 450 volts, with each wrong answer prompting a higher voltage shock. The curiosity and naivety of the volunteers led them to believe they were participating in a legitimate scientific study, unaware of the ethical implications of their actions. As the test progressed, the learner began to respond incorrectly, and the teacher was instructed to administer shocks as punishment for each mistake. The learner, who was actually an actor, would react to the shocks with increasing distress, first grumbling, then yelling in pain, and ultimately falling silent. The researcher's role was critical. He urged the teacher to continue administering shocks, regardless of the distress displayed by the learner, using phrases like, "Please continue," and "You must go on." The outcome was nothing short of astonishing. A large majority of the participants, around 2/3, continued to administer shocks all the way up to the maximum voltage, despite the agonizing sounds coming from the learner. This shocking result revealed a disturbing truth about human nature: the capacity for ordinary individuals to commit acts of cruelty when prompted by an authoritative figure. Mum's experiment not only illustrated the ease with which people could be led to inflict pain on others, but also raised critical questions about morality, authority, and the human condition. The implications were profound, suggesting that the willingness to obey authority could overshadow personal ethics, challenging our understanding of free will and moral responsibility in the process. The Mum experiment emerged during a pivotal moment in history, when humanity was still grappling with the aftermath of World War II. In courtrooms across Europe, the International Military Tribunal was prosecuting Nazi war criminals for atrocities that had shocked the conscience of the world. The systematic persecution and genocide of Jewish people represented a moral failure of such magnitude that it demanded explanation beyond simple evil. What troubled Stanley Mum deeply was a recurring defense offered by many defendants: "I was just following orders." This seemingly simple justification raised profound questions about human nature and moral responsibility. While it was easy to condemn the architects of genocide, the Hitler, Himmler, and Jar Ring figures, What about the thousands of ordinary Germans who staffed concentration camps, transported victims, or pulled triggers? Were these people inherently monstrous, or were they ordinary individuals caught in extraordinary circumstances? Did they bear full moral responsibility for their actions, or was their culpability diminished by the pressures of authority? Most importantly, would Americans, raised in a democratic tradition that emphasized individual rights and moral autonomy, behave any differently under similar pressures? These questions weren't merely academic for Mum. As a Jewish psychologist who had fled Europe, he understood the stakes of such inquiry. If the capacity for blind obedience to malevolent authority was uniquely German, a product of their authoritarian culture, then democratic societies might be naturally immune. But if this tendency was universal, hardwired into human psychology, then no society could consider itself safe from similar moral collapse. Mum designed his experiment to test precisely this boundary. When faced with direct commands to violate their conscience and inflict apparent harm on innocent strangers, how would ordinary Americans respond? Would their moral compass override their tendency to comply with authority, or would they, like the Nazi functionaries, surrender their ethical judgment to someone in a position of power? The experiment would need to create a situation where participants believed they were causing real pain to another person, while simultaneously being encouraged by an authority figure to continue despite any moral qualms. It would need to quantify exactly how far people would go when pushed by authority, and identify what factors might strengthen or weaken their resistance. What Mum couldn't have anticipated was how his carefully constructed laboratory scenario would uncover uncomfortable truths about human nature that would challenge our most cherished beliefs about moral autonomy and reveal the fragility of conscience when confronted with the simple power of a white coat and a confident command. Stanley Mum's analysis of the experiment's results led him to a profound conclusion about human nature. Deep within our psyche lies an ingrained tendency to obey authority, often overriding our moral judgments and personal values. This psychological mechanism isn't merely a peripheral aspect of human behavior. It's a fundamental trait that can supersede individual judgment, conscience, and even ethical principles when activated by authoritative commands. What makes this finding particularly disturbing is that this obedience doesn't stem from fear of punishment. The authority figure in the experiment, a researcher in a lab coat, possessed no real power to harm participants who refused to comply. There were no threats, no coercion, and no consequences for disobedience beyond mild verbal persistence. Yet, the majority still followed instructions to inflict apparent harm on another human being. Mum theorized that participants entered what he termed the agentic state, a psychological condition where individuals view themselves as agents executing another's will rather than as autonomous actors responsible for their own decisions. In this state, people effectively transfer responsibility for their actions to the authority figure, allowing them to perform acts they would normally consider reprehensible without experiencing the full weight of moral culpability. The transition into this agentic state involves several psychological shifts. First, participants' perceptual focus narrows. They become hyper-aware of the authority's voice and instructions while simultaneously becoming less receptive to the suffering of victims. Many participants reported not fully registering the learner's screams or pleas, as though these sounds were somehow diminished or distant. Second, individuals in the agentic state experience a diffusion of responsibility. They no longer feel personally accountable for the harm they cause, instead viewing themselves as mere instruments of a larger purpose defined by the authority. This mental reframing allows them to continue inflicting pain while maintaining a positive self-image. I'm not hurting someone, I'm helping science. Perhaps most troublingly, Mum discovered that once individuals enter the agentic state, escaping it becomes extraordinarily difficult. This entrenchment relates to another psychological phenomenon, the need for cognitive consistency. After administering the first few shocks, participants faced a choice: either admit they had been wrong to hurt someone, threatening their self-image, or justify their actions by continuing to follow orders and retroactively convincing themselves of the experiment's importance. This self-justification creates a dangerous feedback loop. As participants continue administering shocks, they increasingly view their actions as necessary and appropriate. Simultaneously, they begin to devalue the victim, often blaming them for their suffering. If they would just answer correctly, I wouldn't have to shock them. This dual process of self-justification and victim blaming further entrenches obedience. The implications of these findings extend far beyond the laboratory. They suggest that ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of cruelty, not because they are inherently evil, but because social structures and authority figures can effectively bypass their moral reasoning. This insight helps explain how seemingly normal individuals can participate in atrocities when directed by authority, a phenomenon observed repeatedly throughout human history, from Nazi Germany to modern corporate and governmental abuses of power. Understanding these psychological mechanisms doesn't excuse harmful actions, but provides crucial insight into preventing situations where authority can override morality on a mass scale. The implications of Milgram's experiment extend far beyond the laboratory walls, penetrating deeply into the fabric of our social structures and daily interactions. In virtually every aspect of human society, power hierarchies exist, from government institutions and corporate environments to educational settings and family units. Within these structures, most of us occupy positions where we're subject to authority rather than wielding it ourselves. This reality becomes particularly troubling in light of Milgram's findings. If ordinary individuals can be so readily influenced to act against their moral principles under laboratory conditions, what might occur in real-world scenarios where the pressure to conform is intensified by genuine threats to livelihood, social standing, or physical safety? The experiment suggests that many of us may already be unconsciously complying with directives that contradict our personal ethics or values. The psychology of obedience serves a fundamental purpose in human society. It enables collective action, maintains social order, and facilitates the functioning of complex organizations. When properly channeled, this tendency supports social progress and cohesion. However, when exploited by malevolent authorities, it transforms into a terrifying mechanism capable of converting ordinary citizens into unwitting accomplices to atrocity. What we fear isn't the obedience instinct itself, but rather the consequences when this instinct is manipulated by those with harmful intentions. Perhaps most disturbing is Milgram's conclusion that authority can exert greater influence than conscience. This insight carries profound implications for group dynamics and organizational ethics. The presence of a perceived authority figure fundamentally alters decision-making processes, often determining outcomes more powerfully than individual moral reasoning. This phenomenon manifests in numerous contemporary contexts. Criminal organizations and fraudulent multi-level marketing schemes frequently exploit this psychological vulnerability, using authority structures to control members, who might otherwise recognize the unethical nature of their activities. A single mastermind can effectively control dozens, or hundreds of otherwise law-abiding citizens through the careful application of authority principles. Similar dynamics emerge in conventional workplace environments. Employees working under particularly strict or intimidating leadership may find themselves working excessive hours without complaint, participating in questionable business practices, or even targeting colleagues singled out by management. These individuals often develop strong loyalty to authoritarian leaders, perceiving their harsh methods as indicators of competence rather than dysfunction. This helps explain why individuals who display domineering or aggressive behaviors frequently rise to leadership positions across various organizations. By projecting authority, regardless of actual competence, they trigger the obedience response in others. Once followers enter the agentic state, they surrender critical thinking and personal responsibility, allowing the authority figure to direct their actions without question. The consequences of this dynamic can be subtle yet damaging. While obedient employees may appear productive, their compliance often stems from fear rather than engagement. Their focus shifts from achieving genuine results to merely satisfying the authority figure's expectations. This creates a surface, level efficiency that masks deeper organizational dysfunction. Work gets done, but innovation, ethical considerations, and long-term sustainability may suffer. Understanding these psychological mechanisms provides valuable insight into how seemingly good people can participate in harmful systems. It challenges us to examine our own susceptibility to authority and develop strategies to maintain ethical autonomy even when under pressure to conform. In 1961, the Jerusalem courthouse became the stage for a trial that would captivate the world's attention. Adolf Eichmann, a high-ranking Nazi officer charged with orchestrating the deaths of millions of Jewish people, sat before an international audience. The proceedings were broadcast live, with over 500 journalists present and millions watching on television screens across the globe. The public anticipated facing a monster, a demonic figure whose appearance would match the horrific nature of his crimes. Instead, they saw a small, thin man with a wrinkled face and thick black, rimmed glasses who resembled a bank clerk more than a mass murderer. This jarring disconnect between Eichmann's ordinary appearance and his extraordinary crimes became even more pronounced when he spoke his first words in defense. "I was merely following orders. These were tasks assigned by my superiors." Throughout the 8-month trial, Eichmann maintained this position, repeatedly insisting, "I was only obeying commands." Despite this defense, the court ultimately sentenced him to death. However, his persistent claim of just following orders captured the attention of Stanley Milgram, who recognized in Eichmann's defense a profound psychological phenomenon worthy of scientific investigation. Hannah Arendt, who documented the trial, described Eichmann not as a fanatical ideologue, but as an utterly ordinary person among ordinary people, lacking expressive capacity and thinking ability. She observed that anyone who abandons their capacity to judge right from wrong in order to obey authority can be led to commit the most extreme crimes, even the most ordinary among us. Milgram wholeheartedly embraced this perspective, which motivated his design of the obedience experiment we've been examining. The U.S. government provided substantial funding, over $400,000, for this research, hoping to understand how Americans might respond psychologically to extreme situations like nuclear war. The government anticipated findings that would demonstrate American moral superiority and psychological resilience compared to Germans. What they received instead was a devastating revelation. Americans raised with democratic values and individual liberty showed no greater resistance to authoritarian pressure than Germans had during World War II. When placed in situations where authority figures demanded harmful actions, Americans complied at alarming rates. This uncomfortable truth suggested that the capacity for blind obedience transcended cultural and political differences, revealing a universal human vulnerability. However, amid these disturbing findings emerged a crucial ray of hope. Approximately 10% of participants did resist authority and refused to continue the experiment. Notably, many of these individuals held strong religious convictions. This small but significant group demonstrated that while blind obedience might be a common human tendency, it wasn't inevitable. The true significance of Milgram's experiment lies in this revelation: democratic institutions alone cannot guarantee moral behavior under pressure. The formal structures of liberty and individual rights, while valuable, proved insufficient to overcome the powerful psychological pull of authority. Instead, what seemed to provide genuine resistance was a deeply held belief system, a moral framework that transcended immediate authority and provided an alternative source of guidance when faced with ethical dilemmas. This insight challenges us to consider not just the political systems we construct, but the moral foundations we cultivate. Perhaps the most important bulwark against atrocity isn't found in governmental structures, but in the development of individual conscience anchored in principles that can withstand the pressure of authority. The profound implications of the Milgram experiment continue to resonate across disciplines, challenging our fundamental understanding of human nature and moral resilience. While the findings reveal uncomfortable truths about our susceptibility to authority, they also illuminate potential pathways toward a more ethically robust society. The experiment's most significant revelation may be that democratic systems alone, despite their emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, cannot fully protect against the psychological forces that enable atrocities. When confronted with authoritative commands, even citizens raised in liberal democracies demonstrated a troubling willingness to inflict apparent harm on innocent others. This suggests that the formal structures of democracy, while necessary, are insufficient safeguards against moral collapse under pressure. What, then, offers genuine protection against blind obedience? The data points to something deeper than political systems, something rooted in personal conviction and moral framework. The minority of participants who refused to continue the experiment often possessed strong religious or ethical belief systems that provided an alternative source of authority when institutional demands conflicted with basic human dignity. Their resistance wasn't merely a rejection of authority, but rather allegiance to what they perceived as a higher authority, principles transcending immediate social pressure. Rather than lamenting that 82% of participants failed this moral test, perhaps we should ask why so many people lack robust ethical frameworks capable of withstanding authoritative pressure. In our increasingly secular and individualistic societies, have we inadvertently weakened the very belief systems that historically provided moral anchors during ethical crises? Without suggesting any particular religious or philosophical tradition as superior, the experiment raises important questions about the sources of moral courage in contemporary life. Building societies characterized by both courage and compassion requires attention not just to political structures, but to the cultivation of ethical frameworks that can withstand pressure. These frameworks need not be religious in the traditional sense, but they must provide principles that transcend immediate authority and situational demands. Whether derived from humanistic philosophy, spiritual traditions, or other sources, what matters is their capacity to sustain moral autonomy when institutional pressures push toward harm. The Milgram experiment doesn't offer simple solutions, but it provides a crucial starting point for reflection. It challenges us to examine our own susceptibility to authority and develop practices that strengthen moral independence. It invites institutions to consider how they might foster ethical autonomy rather than blind compliance. And it reminds us that the capacity for both extraordinary evil and extraordinary courage exists within ordinary people. The direction we take depends on the moral resources we cultivate. As we navigate increasingly complex ethical landscapes in the 21st century, the lessons of the Milgram experiment remain vitally relevant. They remind us that preventing atrocity requires more than good intentions or democratic institutions. It demands the continuous development of moral courage and ethical discernment at both individual and collective levels. If you've found this exploration thought-provoking, I encourage you to continue investigating the psychology of obedience and moral courage. Consider how these insights might apply to your own life and the institutions you participate in. What sources of ethical guidance help you maintain moral autonomy when faced with problematic demands? How might we collectively strengthen our capacity for principled resistance to harmful authority? These questions, inspired by Milgram's groundbreaking work, remain as urgent today as they were when he first conducted his remarkable experiment.